there's a few familiar faces in here who weren't here in the morning. My name is James McLeod. I'm a history professor here at Evansville, and my Harlexton connection is that I taught British Studies and History at Harlexton from 1994 to 1999. And I've got what I can remember of that period is mostly very happy memories. So what the theme of this panel discussion here today is Harlexton then and now. And once I introduce the panel, I'll tell you kind of how we're going to go about it roughly, and then I'll hand it over to these fine people, and if I need to jump in and maintain order, I will. Excuse me. So the way it's set up is at your right over here is Steve Worthington, who was a member of that first class in 1971, which was long before some of you were born. It's almost before I was born. I don't want to make you feel bad, Steve. And Steve is a fellow Glasgow Rangers supporter, so we have a lot of things in common. Dr. Mike Carson, who many of you know, very recently retired after a 400-year career teaching Shakespeare and other parts of English literature, both at Evansville and Harlexton on at least 5 occasions. Holy mackerel. So Mike was there that very first year, 71, 72, as a young professor, and then returned many times as a steadily older professor. So these are described as the then. The in-betweens. Leanne Wambach was the Dean of Students at Harlexton in 79 and 1980, and currently works on the other side of town at USI. Sandra Dunn, down here, is a sophomore accounting major from Crofton, Kentucky, and is just back from Harlexton, and will be able to tell us from a student's perspective what Harlexton is like now. The other person who I would hope would be able to tell us what Harlexton is like now is your friend and mine, Ed Bujak, Vice Principal for Academic Services at Harlexton and Associate Professor of History, and has been there for a long time too, since 2001. So Ed is, as you all know, a very dearly beloved and very popular professor and friend of many folks in this room too. What Sylvia had suggested to, and I should probably at this point ask for you all to recognize Sylvia DeVault, who's right here, who has worked tirelessly to organizing alumni events is incredibly difficult because alumni are incredibly difficult. So I'm just kidding. You know how much work it takes to put something like this together, so I'm sure you all greatly appreciate it, and we'll have appreciated Rira last night. I'm sure we'll enjoy the dinner tonight. So the way that Sylvia suggested we do it is just go through 3 or 4 or 5 themes, and maybe just go from the old days through the middle to the modern days, and deal with accommodations, you know, what rooms are like, facilities, food, a dear favorite topic of many of us. I was a 5-year veteran of the food committee at Harlexton. I went from not even knowing what peanut butter was to realizing the deep importance of peanut butter to the Midwestern psyche. The academic curriculum, communication with home, travel, and something that is very euphemistically called social life. So we'll keep that one until the end. And how about we just start a conversation, maybe each of you just talk for a couple of minutes, would probably work, on accommodation, you know, what it was like to be there. Steve?
You know, to add to this, yesterday I was in a Harlexton Society board meeting, and Earl Kurt made a great compliment to our class. He said, you know, we really have to get oral history. We have to turn that into written form, all of these memories that we have. he said, you know, that first class, they're really getting up in age. You know, that was one of the first times I thought, well, you know, Social Security won't be that far away. So anyway, accommodations, it was almost like living in two worlds when we first got there. One was, you know, when you first see the manor and the facade and just a wonderful structure, and all the public rooms that were just wonderful. And then you went to your cubicle. And, you know, I found this old memo that David Lawrence, who was our bursar, talked about things like light bulbs. I mean, that was a big thing back then, just finding light bulbs. And enough, well, you know, WC things and all kinds of just things that we take for granted. You think about what has happened now, the conservatory at that time was off limits. You know, the glass shards were perilously hanging there waiting to fall, so that was off limits. The gatehouse, which has been renovated now, at that time was off limits, although a couple of venturesome souls explored it, went through the ceiling, was actually in the hospital for a while, but there were a lot of off limits that have since been renovated. But it was pretty Spartan as far as where we were at that time, where we lived, but otherwise the public rooms were great. You know, we were the first class, some call us the charter class, some, you know, kind of that pioneer spirit, and we can kind of considered ourselves guinea pigs because we really, there was no history before us. So how we actually lived day in and day out kind of set the tone for the needs of others as we went along. So I think that's about it for right now.
Yeah, when do you go next, Mike?
Okay.
Go to the middle.
Well, I came there in the second semester with, as I said in the previous session, an 8-week-old and a barely 2-year-old, and they had accommodated us with a nice flat at the end of the blue corridor, so we were living palatially compared to the students. But you have to remember that in 1971, if I remember correctly, the girls' dorm was off limits totally to men, except in the lounge. Is that right? No? Legally, I mean. And there were hours in the dorms? No? Well, when I first started there, that's what it was. So I get to Harlexton, and you didn't get that memo? And the accommodations turned out to be wherever anybody could claim a place to live, I think. And painted with it, you know, there were named places called the Pit.
Sin City.
And
Sin City.
Sin City, and some things like that I found that students had figured out how to hide, really, essentially, and there was really no governance. Now, I want to ask somebody to correct me on this. This is all about housing, really, but my memory is that there was a female student there at that time who had a boyfriend who was not a student that she kept in there hiding all the time. Is this right? And Jeremy Rusk was always trying to catch her stealing food, but somehow she kept and fed this young man. I think for most of the semester I was there. I don't know, but it was possible because I only went to certain parts of the manor because because I didn't know where anything or anybody was. And finally, when all the students left and we hung around for a couple of days, I walked through the whole cavernous place. It was like the ruins of a civilization after they were gone. And I went down to this is the end of it. There was an Irishman who spoke a language that none of us quite understood, as the guard, Paddy. And Paul, well, I thought he said Patty. And one night we were going out, my wife and I were going out the door, and we said where we were going. He said, oh, they have Bob Beer. And my wife said, oh, is that good? I thought it was a brand. And whenever they all left, we went down to his little office there, and there were all these things he showed where they had deposited their hash pipes, little stones that they turned over as a part of their the civilization that they left behind. Enough said.
Yeah, please.
Could I interject one thing? I forgot about the showers. And I'd really like to know what's, before these ladies talk, what the showers are like. Because all I can remember is in the morning they were freezing cold. And in the, late afternoon or evening they were scalding hot, and there was never anything in between. So is that the way everyone kind of...
Well, I remember that they were scalding hot any time of the day or night when we first got there, because according to David Lawrence, we Americans like lots of hot water. And we finally got him, we like hot water, just not scalding. And so they did turn them down. So by week 4, as I remember.
Lloyd, that's because you never got up before 3 o'clock in the afternoon.
My name's Leanne, and I was the Dean of Students at Harleston in 1979 and 80. So by that time, enough years had passed between the first class and our group that there had been lots of intelligence gathering and lots of sharing of ideas and coping mechanisms and tips on how to get away with things and get around the rules, etc. So I think there was lots of knowledge that had been shared amongst students, past and future students. But this is an aerial photograph that Russell Reed, he was the Bursark when I was there, had taken, and he was an amateur photographer, and he created a very nice booklet that, described lots of different parts of the manor. And I wanted to show you where I lived. I was at the end of the blue corridor, and up a windy little staircase with a tiny little bathroom that had a practically open window, sort of half glass and half just out there with the birds. Let's see. Oh, right here. These tiny little windows are right here. That was my little flat. I got a lot of exercise that year walking the stairs, and I didn't like that elevator at all. But it was very scary, so I got a lot of exercise, like my own Stairmaster routine, getting up there to that room back and forth. The other thing I wanted to tell about the accommodations, at that time, most of the male students were housed in the stables, and they had, I don't know what happened. They were in the stables. Rightfully so. Yes, and that's because when the original building was built, that's where the horses and the carriages and all it would be like our garage nowadays. But anyway, there was lots of space down there, and it was separated from the manor. So that was, most of the male students were there. And then most of the female students were way up high on the 3rd floor. They did complain about the showers. We had the same issues. We had a large group of nursing students that had to get up early, 2 or 3 days a week, and out the door, and so they used up all the hot water. So those certain days, if you didn't get up, then that was it. I thought we had a very responsible housekeeping staff, and lots of other things had been worked out. I think the bugs had been worked out pretty well. One of the things that I wanted to kind of pull these two things together, though, there'd been that intelligence sharing enough, and about the housing, is that, of course, we'll maybe talk about this later, but there was, of course, a no alcohol policy back in the 70s, no alcohol policy in the manor. And however, students were able to use the resources available to them to make beer, and they did that in the bathtubs. So that was like, somebody had told them, okay, when you go, here's the store to go to, you can buy all your supplies at this store. It's not alcohol, so you can bring it on campus. And then they proceeded to create their own party. And a lot of them got very sick. Very sick. Yeah.
So, Earl, it's not that these people are getting old, it's just these people that were drinking the homemade beer 50 years older than they. Thank you.
Accommodation for like last semester, well, the guys were separated. They were like on a 200 corridor, and then the rest, I believe, were like in a carriage house. The showers, yeah, they get cold when you pass the midnight clock hour. And if you were like in the big shower rooms, it was super cold no matter how hot your water was, because it was so drafty, and so you like try to get it done as fast as possible and then get dressed again. Yeah, I don't really.
How many students did you have?
My room, there were 2 other roommates.
I meant the overall.
Oh, overall, I think we were like 130, I think. I'm not quite sure. So,
138. You said 138.
138, close sinks in our room, you get so used to it, and then when you come back to your normal campus, and then you have to like, oh, walk outside in the hallway, try to get to the bathroom, and like everything. So, yeah.
Ed, do you want to?
Well, never having actually lived on campus, I have to say I am shocked. Shocked to discover such a thing going on. I mean, hash pipes, brewing their own beer. There's a lot for our current generation of students to learn from. In terms of growth and in terms of opportunities for misbehaviour, I mean, they're mere amateurs. And so, you know, there's a lot for this congregation to learn from previous generations. In terms of the accommodation, having never lived on campus, I have occasionally been required to spend the night there due to circumstances beyond my control, involving martinis. But the room we stayed in was very nice. I can highly recommend it if you were to spend the night at the college having martinis. Student accommodation, I haven't made a habit of walking around the student dorms, but on the one occasion where they decided to, last semester, convert one into a war room to recreate the Persian Wars and put all the beds together to make a war room and fought a battle for a week, that was really quite superb. I was very impressed with that. The only other problem I would suggest with the current accommodation is the need to move the boys' dormitories from above my office. I would genuinely appreciate not having that level of noise over the top of my ceiling, because I do think one day the ceiling will come down. Other than that, I think the accommodation is very nice, with lots of opportunities for sleep.
Well, it's just a little rebuttal. I didn't know you had private sinks. I think mine was the next level down, and then the showers were, 2 levels down. So we didn't quite have that luxury. And I don't think the stable blocks. We were a class of 88, somewhere in that range, and so everybody lived on, in the main manor.
I'll just say real quick, I lived for 2 years in it was called then the cottage block, and it's now called the carriage house. It's kind of getting nicer names as the years go by, but it was the stables. But my first semester there was a semester where, for whatever reason, very few students came, and so there's only 90, I think. So all the students were up in the manor, and I was all alone down in the cottage block, and it was awesome. It was like having this private estate. And the next semester, it was the opposite. There was, I think, 172 students or something. So I had 4 women's soccer players in the room above my head. And about the 3rd weekend, they had a party. And I was pretty young and thought I was pretty cool and could deal with that. And when about midnight, the plaster in my ceiling started landing on my head, and I grabbed a baseball bat and went up there. So they parted in someone else's room after that. Steve, you wanted to start talking about food? It's a big part of the Harlexton experience.
Well, one thing we learned was institutional food, it's a global problem. And I don't know why I went over there thinking that we would be eating American food. I don't know why I thought that. And quickly learned that it was very English, and peas and mushrooms and tomatoes, different meats, kind of mixed in all different combinations throughout the week. We had and I have to tell a little bit away from the food, we had a situation, and you have to remember this was in the waning years of the Vietnam War, and there was a lot of student unrest on campuses all over. And we tried to form, or Dr. Rusk wanted us to form student representation of government, and we wouldn't do it. We just couldn't come to terms with that. So we had a petition student representation. And what I mean by that is, outside of the dining hall, there was this real long bulletin board. And we had, if you wanted to go on a trip and you wanted some others to go with you, you just put something up on the bulletin board. If you didn't like the food, and that's where I'm headed with this, if you didn't like the food, you'd put a petition up. And if you got enough signatures, then you could go into David Lawrence or Jeremy Rusk and say, here's enough people that we think we ought to have a change. And so that's kind of how the food situation evolved. So we went from pure English food, shepherd's pie and all those good things, to a little more Americanized food. And I know salad bars existed before, you know, but I don't know, I just still think we lay claim to creating the salad bar. And we had ice cream with toppings later on, and I think we even had hamburgers of some sort. But, you know, it was still, if it wasn't English food and it was American, it still had the English flavor to it. Oh, the milk, thank you, Sherry. Milk was so much fun. They brought them in the morning in these huge milk bottles, or canisters. And on the top would be cream. So in the morning you would have cream with cereal or Alpen or whatever it was we were eating. I think it was Alpo, whatever. But the cream would rise to the top, so that's what we would have in the morning, and then as the day. But when it became garlic or onion season, it was, I mean, no one drank the milk at that time, and they wondered why. But it was, okay.
Mike, food?
Oh, and no ice. That wasn't even in the equation.
Well, Steve's covered that pretty well. One of the things that the later generations would be interested to know was that there was no fast food in Europe. They had McDonald's and Colonel Sanders, none of that had arrived. If you wanted a meal, there were two choices: Hop Sing, the Chinese restaurant, and 40 or 50 different fish and chip shops that you could go pick from. I don't remember any other restaurants at all, but it may have been. But so there was no alternative really to getting that. And I don't remember whose mother it was. Somebody's mother came one time from the States and brought I don't know how many, some part of a suitcase full of Big Macs. and anybody remember that?
The Big Mac attacks.
Yeah, and it was like, at least it had to be rancid by the time we got there. But you had to be special just to get one, as I recall. And in a class not long after that, wasn't there, but I heard the story that a bunch of students pooled their money and sent somebody to go to the States and buy a big stack of pizzas and bring them back. So food was never a happy subject, really, as I recall it. When they did the pizza, I think the first time I remember they had things like fish and carrots or something. That sounds reasonable to people who've never seen pizza before.
Tony, the chef, who I see I think is celebrating 30 or 40 years there.
Employee of the month.
Yeah, Employee of the Month. Tony Sheridan started working at Harlexton when he was like 6 years old, I swear. And he doesn't look any different either, it's amazing. But he'd been sitting through these food committee meetings, you know, probably for years. I'm sure he'd heard all of this stuff before. And he'd act like he'd never heard it. He probably still does. He'd be like, peanut butter? Well, I'll have a look, but I don't know. And there was one year, the students were complaining that the bananas in the salad bar were always black. And Tony's like, well, he's from Liverpool, of course, I should have done my Liverpool accent. He's like, well, that's what bananas look like in England. They're black. And the students would have bought it with the dinner students was like, So you had to go out and buy some yellow bananas. Leanne, then.
Thank you. Only thing, besides Hop Sing, I wrote that down right away when you mentioned to talk about food, because that was a retreat, a respite sometimes. And sometimes as a dean of students, I had spent a whole day, causing problems or solving problems and wanted to just get away. So the Hop Sing was a little bit like that, and the folks were so friendly. Is it still there?
Yes.
Is it? It's a very happy memory. Very inexpensive food, and I really enjoyed that. I also got acquainted with English mustard sort of the hard way one time. I think I love mustard on hamburgers, and even, I tried to pretend I had a hot dog and a sausage got English mustard, and I, obviously cleaned my sinuses out. So I got acquainted with English mustard. And the other thing that I actually became very fond of, that we had every day for breakfast, was Marmite. And I know people are, But for some reason, that appealed to me, and I will say this, when I came back after 11 months back to the States, I really felt like I'd eaten healthy. Right away, my parents started feeding me barbecue and fried chicken and all kinds of stuff, and my weight went up. But it's a very healthy lifestyle and a very healthy diet. And
What was Marmite?
Marmite, I'll tell you about it later. So, I can't find it in Evansville, but so if anybody knows how to find Marmite.
I mean, people do get addicted to it. I mean, students periodically, most of them hated it, but they would occasionally. Sandra, what would be your comments on food in the modern world?
Well, we had lots of potatoes. It was surprising when we had a meal that did not include any sort of potatoes. Gravy and well, we had like the traditional British meals at times, but also like kind of semi-American food like hamburgers or something like that. I really like the Yorkshire pudding. I kind of miss that now. Yeah, but we always had like peanut butter and jelly on each table, so every time people were hungry later on in the day, they would just like wrap up the little peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and like snuck them out the, what is it called, refectory, and then like eat it later. But
Where do students eat when they're not eating on campus? What would be the places of choice in Grantham?
yeah, the goose, yes, and like just Witherspoons and like just order some pizza and just hang out in Grantham and find places there.
Pizza delivered. You can get delivered.
I imagine that first group, the appeal of hash pipes disappeared pretty quickly when they realized there was no fast food available. You would have to wait till the morning.
Yeah, I'm just picking up on the pizza delivery. You can usually judge whether that evening's meal has been approved of by the students by the large number of pizza delivery vans coming in. Although having said that, in fairness, potato is a much underrated vegetable, and we in England are very fond of the potato, all the way back to Raleigh. And you can have it fried, you can have it chips, you can have it boiled, you can have it mashed. I mean, it goes with everything. Fantastic. So on behalf of the humble potato, I wish to say it is a staple of the British diet, and if you come into Britain, get used to it.
The other thing I remember about the salad bar was the reappearance of food that hadn't been popular a couple of days before. Like meatloaf or something that people hadn't eaten. It would then get chopped up and served cold in a bed of lettuce in the salad bar, and then if it didn't get eaten that night, it would be back again the next night. When you became a veteran, you'd be encouraging, oh yeah, the cold meatloaf is awesome, you should go for it, because you knew that if you didn't eat it tonight, it would be back tomorrow. And there were times you wanted to put a little mark on stuff to see how many times keep bringing it out again. Yes?
What about digestives? Do you remember those?
Yeah. I mean, if the stuff that when folks come from home to here and they ask what to bring, it's always these kind of like digestive biscuits that you might remember, cookies basically, and rich tea biscuits as well. And then British chocolate is so different, even although there's all the same brand names here. British Kit Kats are so different to American Kit Kats, and in my opinion better. And the thing that really upsets me is that there's lots of ways I want my kids to be British, but I really wish they hadn't inherited my liking for English chocolate, because when it comes, I want to say, oh no, this is the British stuff, you won't like it. They really much prefer it. So the academic curriculum is the next thing on the list, so maybe Mike, if you want to jump in first on the academics, and then Steve, and then we'll go through.
Well, the curriculum at the beginning, I think, was fairly arbitrary. It was a liberal arts curriculum, and then was added to by whoever got to go and teach. So the first semester there was a historian in 1971-72, and in the second semester, me. So there was more English literature than there would have been, although we did have an English tutor right from the beginning. I think there was a sociologist, a British sociologist, a British historian, a British English teacher, and
think it was art appreciation.
Art history. And so that kind of tells you what the curriculum was. And the funny thing, though, was that these Brits had no idea what American college students were. They were used to the tutorial and the lecture system, and so when you get a class of maybe 30 people in freshman composition, that was meaningless to them. Or the one wonderful statement said, "I have to teach world history." There is no world history. there is only British history from the First World War forward or something. But it was academically sound. The students did have classes. It did take tests. It did have to toe the mark, not as willingly as they might have if there had been bigger rewards. But it was very interesting curriculum. I taught Shakespeare and of course in British drama. So we went and here I remember this last night. I took a busload of kids to Stratford and to see Coriolanus, and the Coriolanus' main adversary was played by my mind just went blank. The star Trek.
Aaron Jacqueline.
No.
Patrick Stewart.
He's bald.
Patrick Stewart.
Patrick Stewart. And the play was so well done that we were in the first, second, third rows down there, and they had these blood-tipped swords. And I had blood on my jacket. When this thing was, they were dancing through the air, swinging these swords around, cutting each other with red-tip markers, really. But it was a fantastic performance, and it was one of the most gratifying experiences as a teacher when you take a bunch of kids who are new to Shakespeare, by and large, and they come away thinking, "Wow, this is it. Now we know what it's all about." And so.
Steve, you're nodding.
Well, I was in that audience, and I remember, and they had like boiling pots or smoke or something.
Yeah.
I mean, it was very, very powerful. You know, we didn't have nursing, and we didn't have a lot of the sciences that I think that is now offered. Most of it was the liberal arts. One other thing that was kind of unique for us, at least for the first few years, we were on home campus. We were on a quarter system. And we were on a semester basis over there. There were several other kids from other schools, and they came from schools that had semesters. So we had to translate ours from quarters into semesters. And we did have, I think, which is typical today, 4-day weeks. And usually by Thursday afternoon, you'd already made your plans where you were going for, the weekend. But other than that, I think Mike covered it, but I thought it was kind of tough.
Classes by candlelight was tough too.
Particularly in February, we actually had an unsanctioned trip many of us took to Athens, simply because we were in the middle of a month-long coal miner strike, and we had days when there would be periods of time, 2, 3, 4 hours a day, where we had no electricity, no power, and you didn't always know what the schedule was going to be. And this gray mustache is actually a result of that, because I wasn't going to shave in purely cold water, and so finally I kind of grew this beard, and then it became a Fu Manchu, and then right before my parents came over in May to do a little traveling, it got down to the mustache. But I think I'm off the subject now, but anyway.
Oh, I would just say, the thing that I felt was very unique in terms of coming to Harleston versus going to an American school or anything. I think that one of the things Harleston offered was Brian Simmons and the archaeology program. And I remember just helping him with transportation and occasionally going out for even just an afternoon drive and learning so much and just being enlightened on what that subject is and really understanding more about the history of where I was living. We looked at Roman roads and of course the Roman village, and it just absorbed so much from him. And I just thought that was a unique opportunity that you would not get, anywhere else.
Okay. Sandra.
Well, since I was an engineer major at that time, so we had like the engineering classes offered during that time, which Dr. Layer sitting right here, he was my professor. And also like British studies, like learning about the British culture and everything, going on field trips, seeing the history played out before in front of you, and kind of getting a feel of what it really is like and how Great Britain came together like it is today. It's just a really an eye-opener that you really cannot see by just reading a textbook or something like that. And so that's what I can say about the curriculum. It's really phenomenal.
Dr. Bujak, do you know anything about the academics?
A little bit. But it's very interesting to hear what's been said in terms of how things have evolved, because you mentioned how there was 4 British professors there at the start, and then we've just finished with British Studies, and it's interesting how that British Studies idea came out of that original model, that you would still stick with 4 professors from 4 disciplines, but you then try and bring it together into one package as opposed to 4 streams. And that's pretty much what we've got now. At the heart of the program is the British Studies course. It's 6 credits. Some of my former students who survived the horrors that were British Studies have turned out, which suggests that they weren't too damaged by the experience.
Still have nightmares.
Oh, well, that's good. So, we have, and again, as we just mentioned, we're now really trying to push a lot harder in terms of getting out and about and using the local area much more fully. One of the traditions that have lasted for the last, I think, 15, 20 years of British Studies is going to Lincoln. For the spring, it's not so bad. For the fall, when you're on the top of Lincoln Hill in the sleeting snow, when you're trying to walk through the snow and the cold and the wind and the rain and talk about Roman ruins, you get a real flavour of what it would have been like to have been a legionary up there in a toga. And alongside that, then we've built in all the other professors still come from the partner colleges, from UE, etc., and put in another set of courses, so you get a full curriculum, and again, by Thursday afternoon, trying to hold the line for the 410 classes that want to actually end at 310, and the 310s that want to end at 210, and ideally it would be better if we ended at midday on Thursday week. In actual fact, why do we have Thursday classes at all?
Then we can start on Wednesday.
Then we kind of finish like midday, Wednesday, you know. So it gets the dynamic tension between the study and the travel tends to come to the fore about midday Thursday. That's where it gets fun.
I remember, education takes place on the field trips, but on the fun weekend trips too. I remember the first time I took a bunch of students to Edinburgh, and there was going to be a stop at Hadrian's Wall. And although I grew up in Scotland, I'd never actually been to Hadrian's Wall. And when I was doing the pre-trip briefing, I sold Hadrian's Wall pretty well. I conveyed the impression to these students that Hadrian's Wall was kind of like the British equivalent of the Great Wall of China. It was this gigantic edifice that could be seen from space. We got to the part of Hadrian's Wall that we visited, and I mean, if you blinked, you would miss it. It was at no point was it higher than this, and it was just this collection of bricks, basically, on the ground. And one of the students, and you'd had to go quite a bit off the beaten track to get there in the first place. And several of the students protested vehemently about how they'd been, how they'd been had. And so I said, but you have to remember that people were much, much smaller. The fact that they didn't react like that were kind of so I just went with it. So, the Romans were small and they were facing these tiny naked savages riding Shetland ponies. And at one point, I think she was an archaeology major, kind of said, "Dr. McLeod, that's bullshit." There was a few pretty ashamed guys that are reminded of that pretty much the rest of the semester. Something obviously that's changed enormously is our next topic, which is communication. Steve, when you were trying to get stone tablets flown home.
We were a little more advanced. I actually brought a visual for our first class. If you remember our airgrams, and under almost penalty of death, don't put any inserts, otherwise it'll go by ground mail. But this was really our form of communication. I think I made one phone call to my folks, and it was around Thanksgiving. And it was a major, it was very expensive. You had to get the right international operator, and it took forever. And you'd be running out of coins, and then you'd be sitting there, and it would take forever then for the international operator to finally connect you, you know, with the States. It was just so arduous that it ended up. And, you know, we would gather, and I can't remember exactly when the mail came, but we all had our slots, and I'm sure you all did, you know, do too. But, you know, you would just, you know, you would almost want to read. If you didn't get your mail that day, didn't get any envelopes from home, you know, you wanted to just sit there with someone else and read their letter. It was just that kind of communication. No computers. Now it's all Wi-Fi, but I mean, you have it's whatever. But you know, I was fortunate that both of my sons had an opportunity to go to Harlexton, and we did, I think it was called, Susan, instant messaging.
Yeah.
That was really a breakthrough for us to be instant messaging with our older son. Our younger son, we actually had the capability of Skype, and but anyway, you know, but we didn't have any cell phones, so there was that. And I remember, I'll just tell one quick little travel story that I know we're going to get into, but there were a group of us, 3 different groups that were going to Paris. It was like the first weekend we were there. And we were going to meet at the Arc de Triomphe at like 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And so I, being the diligent student, and everyone in my class knows I really was, but I waited until after the classes on Thursday. And I flew over. And there were a couple of others that were going to hitchhike, and I don't know quite how they figured out they were going to hitchhike across the channel. But anyway, I got there at 4 o'clock. I was so proud of myself, and there are thousands and thousands and thousands of people. They're having some big parade. So how do you find your classmate? You don't just pull your cell phone out and say, "Where are you?" or "Let's meet here." I mean, you're just, so I spent the weekend all by myself, which was, you know, for somebody who had never been away from home except for Camp Carson for a week, and, you know, I'm there all alone, no form of communications, and, you know, computers weren't even, and if I had a digital camera, you know, all the memories that, you know, film processing was very expensive. You know, Dan Derrick was kind of our resident photographer over there, but it was very expensive. So, you know, the technology has just changed. So
that's great. Thanks, Mike. You live in Camp Carson. What do you?
Yeah, I really have nothing to add to that, except that one of the things we did, because we had grandchildren, who were our children, but we would send back home slides for our grandparents to see, so that they know what their grandchildren were growing into while we were there, because we didn't look back, and we never called, and didn't write that much. So that was our upgraded technology to send back home slide pictures of the grandkids at wherever they were. And it's hard to believe now, really, how different it is, because I've been there, you know, early and late, that the students in that first group were really out of touch for 9 months, really, virtually, with their families, and some of them were only 18 years old. I think Kathy was only 17 when she got there. So it was quite a different world.
Leanne, what about late 70s, early 80s?
Still the same as Steve, as I recall. There was more phone communication. It was not as hard. Once you decided to make a call, it was not as difficult. And I did hear from my folks, maybe once a week or every other week or so. The only thing that we dealt with was the time difference, 6 hours or 7 hours difference. And there were very few phones that you could use. There were the Manor phones, and you had to have a credit. You could use a credit card, and et cetera. But that's about it. Yeah, a lot of letters, a lot of those little blue things like TV shows.
Senator, you want to talk about the present a little bit?
Well, of course. We have Skype now, and which is well, it was funny because like a lot of students would just like sit around sporadically all like across the Manor inside and find a little spot that they like, and then like Skype and like give tours to their family. So it was like in a way of like showing your family back home how it is what you live in a big mansion. And some of us students had like the ability to have like a broadband like cell phone, or like they got like a little simple one and grant them just to communicate among students. And also like mail. It's still awesome today to get like a little slip of paper that says you got a package, and then you're like yeah, American candy and everything. What else? So yeah.
I don't have to eat this. damn English chocolate. Ed?
Well, the turning up of the food parcel is always a great event, particularly when we get the large ones coming in with a month's worth of supplies for a week. The technology has changed considerably just in the time that I've been there, and certainly the use of laptops and the ability to Skype has, I think, changed the experience somewhat. I mean, you're much more closer to home, there's more communication. So inevitably that changes the experience. The one thing I would suggest about Skype is it is somewhat disconcerting on first experiencing it, because most of the students that I've seen using Skype tend to use the library corridor, and there's some really nice sofas there, there's some nice sunshine, so it's warm, unlike most of the manor. And the first time I encountered Skype, there was a student sat there with the laptop open and a little ball on the top of the screen and chatting away. And I thought, well, hash pipes, obviously. They're having a conversation with the wall. This is somewhat bizarre. So I'm walking down thinking, okay, and they're chatting away. So I thought, well, are they actually talking to me? So I thought, I'll join in and say hello. Dr. Bujek, I'm talking to my mother. Oh, I do. So Skype, yeah, it's a strange thing on first encountering with a little ball on top of the screen, but I think it's a good thing. There was when it was first suggested about turning the manor completely Wi-Fi, there was a serious debate about, will you end up with students just in their rooms with the door shut, communicating back with the States? But in fact, it hasn't worked like that. I mean, it's now, you find them laying all over the damn place. Open, chatting away. So after the initial introduction of Skype, and you did have kind of an individualized experience for a while there, it's now turning into a kind of group Skype thing in the trader lounge, or a group Skype in the library. Books, I mean, forget using books. But I think it's a good thing. It's a good thing to keep that connection going for kids across the way.
Okay, the last two topics we have, we've got about 10 minutes, I think, scheduled left. Are travel and social life. Maybe you could even marry these together. Sometimes the one happens with the other, I understand.
Well, we obviously did a lot of traveling, and we had the 3-day weekends. We had a lot of the usual trips that the university provided for us, the bus trips. Went to Edinburgh, Nottingham, Leicester, Lincoln early on, Stratford, a lot of the usual trips. We had I think it was almost at least 5 weeks, if not 6 weeks, between semesters. I think it was December 22nd, because my father actually wanted me to come home, so I surprised my mom and the rest of the family by showing up. And then I came back to the manor and no one was there. So I thought, well, I'm going to travel. And, not knowing geography that well, I thought, Scandinavian countries, that's great. Think about January in Scandinavia. There's a lot of snow, a lot of ice, very cold. But they really liked tourists at that time. Traveling was very easy in terms of the youth hostels. And I think we did a lot of hitchhiking that, I don't know if that's still prevalent, but that was kind of a standard way of getting. We didn't have the minibus going to Grantham as often, and we did a lot of walking. And we could almost spend an hour just talking about the changes in the Gregory Arms, but the Greg was kind of our away from the manor, and we had some other pubs, Welby Arms and all, but we did a lot of traveling. I think everyone took off for the continent during the holidays. So. And when you think about the changes in communication versus, we still use public transportation over there. The usual, the buses, the underground, the ships and the ferries and plane and trains and whatever, and I don't think that has changed. I wish we had the channel. That would have given us one more, option. But really, travel was, I think, probably the least of the changes.
I'll just say a word. As I said, we had, from the faculty board, we had these 2 children. So I bought an old Mercedes actually, and the other history professor who stayed on for the second semester to do research, and bought what's a camping trailer, a caravan, and we'd pile in that thing every other weekend and go somewhere. And we ended up taking it across the channel and traveling all the way down into Italy with it. But it was always amazing to me how the students became so resourceful and you know, went to, you know, as you said, going very far away here would be a big deal, you know, to go to Denver for a weekend, you know, and there they would manage to get to the beer fest in Germany in one of these dilapidated cars and make it back somehow or other, not often with the car they left in. It was always an adventure. Everything was an adventure. You know, you had to find out. The only reason we bought the camping trailer is because if you go to bed and breakfast, even though this kid was 2 months old, we had to pay full fare for it. So we knew, well, this is easy. And in those days, there were very few of these around. We could park it anywhere. We parked it in Paris, in Rome. It was, you know, just a different ballgame.
Yeah, our travel we did a lot of 3-day weekends, and we had a couple of long weekends that were planned for us. Our fall trip was to Moscow, and that was in 1979. We toured the Summer Olympic Stadium and several other locations, and of course, if you remember that the Summer Olympics were canceled, or at least the U.S. participation in the Summer Olympics, was canceled, so the athletes never got to Moscow, but we got to see where they would have been. The other spring trip was to Rome, and that was very welcome in February to get to a warmer climate after the English winter. I wanted to say something else about the social activities. One of the unique things that I'm comparing notes here with other folks as we talked last night at REROC, there was a period of time in the late 70s where University of Evansville had really tried to reach out, Dr. Wallace Graves had really tried to reach out to the international student population and have University of Evansville become more internationally recognized. Because of that, Harlaxton College became a stopping point for young students who had maybe never been to America, but they intended to come to a U.S. college at some point. So we had, out of 150 students, we had people from 20 countries on our campus. From Libya, from Liberia, from Nigeria, from all of the Middle Eastern countries, of which I had to look up on a map. We had students that had never been, they had one American parent, you know, to talk with them, you could not tell that they lived in another country, but they'd never been to America. Their parents were expatriates, they were working for international companies, and that really expanded our experience a great deal. It really impacted our social experience and the lifelong sort of impact that the Harlaxton experience had on students. I wanted to share another part of that is that last summer, that group from 79-80 had their own reunion at Harlaxton. I was not able to go, but just last night, I had 27 friends and students from that same group, including 2 from Turkey, together at my home. And so there's that whole international aspect that, as I said, apparently was just for that one period of time.
Yeah, I mean,
really added a great deal.
I would say in the early 90s when I got there, that was still very much in the back of people's minds. Almost all of the big legendary stories at that time featured these kids from the other parts of the world.
Yes.
I'm talking about no cell phones. It was the story of the first cell phone that any of the Evansville students had ever encountered was some Saudi kid who had a really fancy car with a huge big car phone in it. And this kid had, you know, more money than he would ever spend in his life, so he would just let whoever wanted to call home go down and sit in this fancy car and talk, you know, Mom, I'm on a car phone. That's a great experience. But I think, you know, the sad story was alluded to earlier by Mike. It was, I think, 4 Middle Eastern young men who were killed in a car wreck on the drive, and I think that's really when students buying cars and doing stuff in cars came to an end. And I think about that time there was a decision to put the bistro downstairs, or at least put more effort into the bistro to say, you know, these kids are all 18, they're going to drink beer. Let's give them a safe environment to do that, keep them off the roads. And I understand the trees down by the football field are dedicated to these young men. And the last thing I'll throw in there is that one of the security guards who was there for years when I was there, Mr. Dowman, he was the first police officer to arrive at the scene that night, and he said it was probably 20 years on at that point, and he said that of all the things he saw in I think a 40-year police career, that was the thing that stuck with him the most. Just a real sad experience. So I think with all the sort of joyful memories we have, it's important to think sometimes about these memories too. So today, in terms of traveling and social life, you want to talk a little bit to us about that?
Well, the trains are still there and everything else, so you can easily get from one place to the other. Usually, like a group of people will get together and decide where to go. But today, with the technology that we do have, we just like booked a flight and we're like, hey, let's go to Rome or Greece or Ireland on our own or things like that. And if you don't have a travel buddy, you can always next to the what's it called? Well, there's a bulletin board down there where you can sign up for just to get a travel buddy, so you don't have to go by yourself if you really wanted to go somewhere. And yeah, so it was just you just be out there and you can. It is so easy to travel in Europe just because you have the trains and you can just fly in an hour away to some foreign country you've never been to. Yeah.
We were probably flying on the same planes that Sandra was. They just newer then.
Probably the same trains too.
I'd just like to pick up on what Mike was saying about the whole kind of sense of adventure thing, and it really is quite remarkable when you come in on it. You have the tension on a Thursday as everybody's deciding where they're going to be travelling for that weekend, and then you come into class on a Monday and you think, well, what have I done this weekend? This weekend I've cut my lawns, I've done some marking. And you get to class, you say, what did you do this weekend? Oh, I've been to Budapest, I've been to Warsaw, I've been to St. Petersburg, I decided to go to Minsk. And then you listen to the conversations and you see all the activity that goes on in the travel office outside of what's now the student development office. And you've got all these maps and all these destinations and all these possibilities, and everybody's going, well, no, that's too cheap, we'll go on this airline and we'll travel to there, and then we'll take a connecting airline to there, and they're just traveling all over Europe and everywhere. It's amazing, it really is. And you just get these fantastic conversations. I was sat down at the refectory, last week, and just on my own, a couple of students sat down, get chatting. How are you? What's going on? Oh, fine. Where are you going anywhere good this weekend? Yeah, going to Chernobyl. As you do. You can get a package tour of the Chernobyl nuclear reactor. Apparently, you can just walk around it and the daily dose of radiation is okay. I did inquire about how the daily dose builds up for the tour guides, but no one seemed to ask about that. But essentially, I mean, you've got all these fantastic travel possibilities, and they're just taking full advantage of it, and it's a great adventure, and it's wonderful to hear.
Tony Sheridan has figured out we can get bananas really cheap. They're really bright yellow. The only thing I would throw in about travel was I've said this hundreds of times, it always really struck us that first weekend when the trip down to London, and you'd go in your buses and you'd be in whichever hotel. We were in several different hotels back then, and the student affairs people and whoever the faculty chaperones were, we'd be meeting up and meeting our friends in London, and you'd be in the lobby, and as you got ready to leave the lobby, there'd be this little kind of trail of students who would be following you, not talking to you, but just too scared to go out into London without keeping you in sight. And you can imagine how terrifying that is. You've just come to Harlexton, you've never been outside of Boonville, and suddenly you're in London. And then fast forward about 6 weeks, and you'll talk to these same students, and it'll be that Monday morning, and they'll be like, yeah, we were in Prague, and Tom got his bag stolen, and he had to go and get a new passport from the embassy, and it was a great, and it's like they cope with it perfectly. And then at the end of the semester, their parents come, and their parents are terrified, and it's these 20-year-olds who are showing their parents how the Paris Underground works. And so it just seems to me like it's such a common theme. There's all of these, we can emphasize all of these differences, but what I'm really hearing too is that an awful lot of it really hasn't changed. And as Mike very eloquently began our first session this morning, Harlaxton's such a wonderful, special place to all of us, transformed all of our lives in numerous ways. And that was the experience with that first class. I know, talking to a couple of the spouses outside, these folks haven't stopped talking about it for 40 years, and nor should they. And my wife was at Harlaxton, and so she sort of understands, I think, when I start telling these old stories. But we've all had our lives changed by it, and the British faculty, those who lived in there, and those who've made a huge impact on the place too, they're also, I think, changed, and your life changed by it. And really, there's the building and the stones and all of that Mike talked about, but ultimately Harlaxton is the people, the folks who run it, the people who teach there, and maybe more than anything else, the people who come over, the faculty spouses, and you, the students. So the first 40 years have been great. Here's to the next 40 years, and here's to many more happy reunions. Thank you to everybody.